This is the second in the Lansdowne Malvern public debate series. The topic is affordable housing or green fields. The panellists are Julian Roscombs, the local parliamentary candidate for the Green Party, Richard Chammings, the local candidate for UKIP, Frank Hill, who is the chair of Worcestershire Council for the Preservation of Rural England, Richard Grounds, the executive director of Fortis Living, and Dennis Wharton, the local parliamentary candidate for the Liberal Democrats. In a question time debating format, each panellist is given time to give an introduction before questions are submitted to them from the audience. The independent chairperson is the Reverend Ian Howarth, the chairman of the Birmingham district of the Methodist Church.
With a 4-minute limit to you each, Richard, would you like to set us off?
Certainly. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Always worth checking that out first. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Grounds. I'm a director at Fortis Living, a local housing association providing 15,000 affordable homes in Worcestershire and Herefordshire. And I'd like to start off by asking why we have a housing crisis. And the simple reason is we're not building enough new homes each year. It's widely recognised that in the UK we need to be building around 250,000 new homes each and every year. And you might think that sounds an awful lot of new homes. Why do we need so many new homes? Well, quite simply, we have a growing population in the UK. Population has grown by about 5 million people since the turn of the millennium, and last year increased by 400,000 new individuals in the country. In addition to that, new households are forming at a rapid rate. We have over 200,000 new households forming each year. So if we need 250,000 new homes a year, how are we doing at the moment? In a word, terribly. Recognising that 250,000 new homes are needed, let's just have a quick whiz through the last 5 years and see how many homes we built of all tenures in the UK. In 2010, 107,000. 2011, 114,000. 2012, 116,000. 2013, 109,000. And last year, 2014, a projected 120,000. So, for each of the last 5 years, we've built less than half the number of new homes that the country needs. In fact, we haven't built 250,000 new homes a year since 1978. And if you want a longer perspective, the number of new homes being built now is fewer than in any peacetime year since the First World War. Unbelievable. Bringing ourselves forward in time a bit, I imagine some of you were around in 1968, looking at the audience, and that year we managed to build 425,000 new homes, both for sale and for rent. Not only did we manage to do that in 1968, we also managed to complete the M1 motorway and the first series of Dad's Army. So a good year, I think. So what are the consequences of not building enough new homes? It's a fact that owner occupation is now out of the reach of many people. The average age of first-time buyers is 37. First-time buyers need to earn at least £36,000 to stand a chance of getting on the property ladder. 2/3 of first-time buyers receive financial help from their families. And in the 25 to 34 years age group, only 36% own their own home, just a third. Let's have a look at the local situation. Malvern Hills is the least affordable location in the West Midlands. The average house price is £240,000, but the average salary is just £23,000. So you will need more than 10 times your salary to afford a mortgage. So it's simply not feasible for those on lower or average incomes to get on the property ladder. The alternative of the private rented sector isn't at all attractive, with very high rents in that sector. We're also seeing a booming housing benefit bill. Yep. Growing from 8 billion to 20 billion in the last 20 years. We also have 20,000 households on waiting lists for affordable rented housing in Worcestershire. But we only managed to build about 500 affordable rented homes in the county each year. So what can we do by building more homes? I'm going to rattle through it very quickly.
Please.
We can bring house prices under control. We can give the younger generation a chance of owning a home. We can give hope to the 20,000 people on waiting lists for affordable housing. We also can give a boost to the local economy. So our focus has to be on more affordable housing as an affordable alternative to the prohibitive costs of owner occupation and the overheated private rented sector.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
So Frank, from the CPRE's perspective, that need for all those new houses, how do you respond?
Well, I'll let you guess. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I represent the Campaign to Protect Rural England, which is a non-political charity which aims to protect the English countryside from excessive and inappropriate development. Founded in 1926, we had our main successes during the 1940s and 50s, with the setting up of national parks, areas of natural beauty, and green belts. Over the last 60 years, it has been impossible to do more than slow down the tide of urbanisation, as our population has been increasing by an average of 250,000 every year. One reason for this increase is that many of us are living 10 to 15 years longer than people did a century ago, which I suppose is a good thing. The main factor, however, is immigration. Although we are supposed to be part of a united kingdom, there has been little sharing out of these huge numbers of immigrants. About 97% of immigrants come to England and stay here. We now have 11 times the population of Scotland. We have more people than either France or Spain, each of which country is over 3 times as large, and more than Poland or Italy, which are both more than twice as large. Hence, the England countryside is being eroded faster than in any other country of the UK, and indeed any country in Europe. There is now less than half an acre of productive farmland per person, and we are increasingly dependent on imported food. We have, of course, seen this urbanisation of the countryside around Malvern. Until the 1950s, Malvern was a small town nestling at the foot of the hills with branches out towards Malvern Link and Barnard Green. Since then, it has grown like a one-sided mushroom, stretching further and further to the east and northeast. Only Hazeland Field survives as a relic of the huge area of fields and orchards that used to stretch from Graham Road to Madresfield. And now we're on the verge of losing even more countryside between Malvern and Worcester due to the South Worcestershire Development Plan, with hundreds of houses earmarked for Newland and Lower Broadheath, and over 2,000 south of the Worcester bypass. Turning to affordable housing, there is no doubt that we do need more affordable housing. The shortfall began in the 80s under Mrs. Thatcher's government. She was convinced that England was going to become a nation of homeowners. Of course, this didn't happen. More recently, builders of housing estates have been urged to make up to 40% of houses affordable. In reality, this sometimes falls to nearer 30%. This isn't enough. We need to create new funding arrangements so that half of all the new houses built are affordable. So in my view, we should protect the countryside and provide more affordable houses in the short term by increasing the proportion of affordables built on new housing estates, and in the long term by greatly reducing the number of immigrants. If we don't do this, the housing supply will never catch up with the housing demand. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
So, going along from the far end then, Julian, this balance of lots of new houses we needed and preserving countryside.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. By abandoning house building to the private sector, successive governments have let us down. Local authorities no longer build, and so fewer homes are being delivered than at any previous peacetime period since the First World War. 109,000 completed in 2013, compared to around 300,000 in the 50s to the 70s. Just 5% of government housing expenditure spent on building is spent building new homes. Developers respond to the market, building homes for those who can afford to pay top prices for them and are not interested in meeting the urgent need for affordable homes. With a shortage of homes, the waiting lists for social housing had never been longer. More than 1.8 million are now on the waiting list for a home, an increase in 81% since 1997. Some families living in desperate conditions are being forced to wait years for a suitable home. They may have to live for months in temporary accommodation, uncertain where they'll be moved to next, or how much longer they'll have to wait for stability. Every 15 minutes, a family with children is made homeless in this country. Others will be left with no choice but to live in the private rented sector. With short-term leases, unpredictability, poor conditions and high costs, this form of housing is often unsuitable for many households, especially the vulnerable and those in need of a stable, secure home. The Green Party has committed to building 500,000 socially rented homes by 2020, increasing the social housing budget from 1.5 to 6 billion by 2017. We'll raise 5 billion by scrapping mortgage interest tax relief on buy-to-let property. This move will also greatly reduce housing benefit costs, too large a proportion of which currently go straight to private landlords. We'll remove the borrowing caps on councils so that they can start to work with local communities to start building the sorts of homes that we need, where we need them, and when we need them. Community co-builds and self-builds are able to deliver high-quality, energy-efficient homes quickly and cheaply. Development that preserves our green spaces, creates livable, safe places, and promotes community well-being and local employment opportunities. But it's not just about building homes. Many of the 700,000 empty properties in this country should be brought back into profitable activity by using empty property use orders. We'll also remove council tax concessions for second and empty homes. And in time, we'll look towards replacing council tax with a land value tax to promote positive land use and making it unprofitable for developers to land bank. We'll better support privately renting tenants and take action on soaring rents. While development must, wherever possible, make use of existing brownfield sites and would favour refurbishment over demolition and rebuilding, removing favourable VAT treatment on new builds compared to renovations, there has always been small-scale development in the countryside, and we'd favour low-impact developments in rural areas where they can meet rural housing needs and help with local economic regeneration. Sheer human decency tells us that affordable, secure housing is a right, not a privilege. The housing crisis isn't about houses or profit, it's about people and it's about homes. In 1945 it was said, "We've been dreamers, we've been sufferers, and now we are the builders, and it is time for our communities to start building once again." Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. So Richard, C.
Good evening. Now I know what Roger Bannister felt like with 4 minutes to go. That's 9 seconds. The population of this country has increased by, it's already been said, 5 million over the last 10 years or so. Recently, it's been increasing by about 300,000. That's the population of a city the size of Portsmouth or Hull, if you like, each year. So it's no wonder that we're short of housing. And of course this is mainly, not entirely, but mainly due to uncontrolled open door immigration. Tony Blair said he wanted to change the face of Britain, but he and successive governments haven't made any provision for this increase in the population, which of course has been of their making. The question is, of course, where do we build these houses? And of course the developers like greenfield sites because it's an open canvas, a clean blank canvas, and they haven't got problems with contamination and the like. Certain councillors on Malvern Hills District Council, I have to say Conservative councillors, also like greenfield sites because they've got a vested interest on development on their own land. The campaign for the protection of rural England recently actually came up with a figure of 66,000 hectares of brownfield sites available, which would satisfy our housing needs for the next 4 years. And UKIP would certainly give tax breaks to developers who wanted to build on these brownfield sites. Also in the Malvern Hills District Council area, there is, and it's already been mentioned, there's 1,028 empty houses, a lot of these long-term, which could be brought back into use. Also, if we're talking about land and the shortage of land in Britain, the University of Cambridge recently said that there's 2 million hectares of farmland we're going to be short of by the year 2030. This is due to energy crops being grown, solar panel farms, and of course housing. And land basically being concreted over. As a last resort, of course, greenfield sites may have to be used. But if so, it's important that local people make the decisions where the houses are going to be and how many houses, and not a government inspector sent in from Bristol. Coming on to affordable housing, and of course, you know, this is small houses. There's a lot more single people around now, from split up from partnerships and the like. Young people want to get on the housing ladder and social housing. There's a lot of competition. This drives up house prices. We've got the golden generation who've, of course, done well from their pensions, etc., buying houses to let, which again pushes up prices, and this could well get worse in April with the change in the pension rules. But home ownership, actually interesting, some figures. 1953, home ownership was about 50%. 2001, it was at a peak of 69%, and it's estimated by 2030 that'll be dropped down again to 50%. So home ownership isn't the be-all and end-all, but it is important that there's affordable housing for everybody, housing for everybody. And people, of course, you know, they move around more now, they commit less, and it might be they don't necessarily want to buy their own homes. So we need more housing, especially affordable housing. It's up to local councils, I think, to decide and drive a hard bargain with developers, as to the percentage of affordable houses. And of course, developers like buying the more expensive houses with ensuite bathrooms and the like because it's more profitable for them. But local people must decide where they're going to be put as well, and preferably brownfield sites must be given preference. Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, Dennis, from the Lib Dem point of view.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. Okay. Affordable housing. It's about providing good quality house building for people to live in fulfilled lives at a cost that they can afford. A severe shortage of affordable homes is what has caused the housing crisis, with demand outstripping supply. But the housing crisis is not just about houses, it's about people. The lack of affordable and decent houses and inflated prices has resulted in home ownership slipping out of reach for most people, young people in particular, asking for 7 times people's income. Totally unaffordable. So why aren't we building enough houses? The National Housing Building Programme has failed to meet the huge demand for affordable housing, both nationally and locally. A severe shortage of affordable homes is what caused this crisis. Some of the reasons for this are shortage of available land, especially brownfield sites, but there is a lack of that in Malvern. Land sitting idle and previously used for development and strong opposition to build on green fields and especially farmland, and that the private sector does not have the capacity to build enough houses per year in order to resolve this crisis on their own alone. What other issues then arise from the limited supply of affordable housing? If demand of affordable housing continues to outstrip supply, then this will result in disposable income, as we know, goes towards paying unacceptably high yield rents, inflated house prices, and this is concerning because it will result in housing poverty, because economic stability and family budgets are threatened directly. And many of our green fields and farmland is under threat of development. Farmland in this constituency is a major part of the rural economy, and we need to protect that to some degree. It's not just for jobs, but it's a way of life, and to safeguard our ability to be self-sufficient in an uncertain world to avoid rural poverty. So what will happen if we continue to fail to provide enough housing? In simple economic terms, a housing bubble. We've all been there. It's a nightmare to go there. A housing crash is what we want to avoid. A large part of this problem is there's far too much focus on providing housing for London and the South East. That's part of causing this bubble. Why not spread that across the UK? As part of creating a northern powerhouse, distribute it evenly and ease the burden. The fear is the housing market will crash, plunging many house owners into negative equity. And many of us already know that that's happened before. But will the market crash and threaten economic stability and our way of life? If first-time buyers become unable to get onto the housing ladder, yes, it will. The market will probably crash. But there are measures in place to avoid this catastrophe, such as the present Help to Buy scheme. Yes, there are schemes in place. Doesn't solve the problem entirely. So what measures can be taken to address the unaffordable issue? The simple answer to this is build more houses. Good quality homes, though, reduce demand and house prices will fall. But we need to do it on an unprecedented level. And we can't do that in Malvern alone. We can't just solve that problem locally. It has to be nationally as well. Local government can build more houses. They should be given the right and to allow to do that more. Nationally, the government can get involved and build more houses on a mass scale as well, because we're not meeting those targets. It has to be done. To find solutions in the housing crisis is not an easy one to resolve, and in my view, it's all about getting the right balance. We need good quality houses at an affordable price that takes into account of the community, and any proposals to build must be by local needs and sympathetic to its local surroundings, with reducing the effects on the local infrastructure and the quality of life for its residents. And if I was elected MP for this constituency, I would fight for a balanced approach, for balanced communities, and resolve this housing crisis on not just a local level, but a national level as well. I'm passionate about protecting our prized green spaces, farmland, but at the same time, I'm a balanced person. I want to get a balanced solution. I aim to promote and support the building of affordable housing according to local needs. And for a balanced approach, for a balanced community, for a stronger economy, a fairer society, please support the Liberal Democrats.
I think, without choosing one or the other, I think we want to thank all the people for keeping roughly to their 4 minutes, and can we say a thank you to them? About 30 questions were submitted. I'm told we will probably have time for 5 or 6, depending on the response. So I do apologise if you're not called. I'm going to ask Douglas Guest if he would share his question with us, please.
How will these houses be funded? All the panellists agree that more houses are needed, but how will each party finance them?
Right. We'll start, I think, with the politicians, but then Richard perhaps would have an idea from the Housing Association as well. So So if we start with Dennis.
Hi, Douglas. Thanks for your question. Okay, well, to resolve the housing crisis, there are various funding aspects in which to do that, depending on who's building the houses, I guess. So whether it's on government level, whether it's a help to buy scheme where government does lend a proportion of money to help people buy houses, and there's local governments who should be getting involved in building houses and building them and selling those.
Do they have the resources to do that in this area?
In terms of land,
No, in finance, I was thinking.
I'm not aware of the finances in this local area to do so.
I've got someone indicating.
Yeah.
Mike, we have to wait for the mic, sorry.
Julian Roscombe's mentioned the answer to that question and the reason why we have developed such a terrible shortage of housing of all types since the late 70s. Julian mentioned the borrowing caps on local authorities. And what has happened, I've worked in housing for over 40 years, I retired recently. Since the late 70s...
Hold it down a little.
Sorry?
Little bit further away. You're just distorting.
Since the late 70s, successive governments of the three main parties have blocked local authorities from sensibly borrowing money in order to invest that money long-term in the building of public housing assets which themselves produce a return through rental income. And I cannot understand for the life of me why the three main parties persist with that policy, and the only party that is offering an alternative and suggesting we lift those borrowing caps in this election is the Green Party.
Right, thank you. Do you want to respond to that, Julian? I mean, other than to say yes.
He's had his piece.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with the gentleman. The local authority caps need to be lifted. Local authorities can borrow very cheaply, but they're not being allowed to do so at the moment. But also, I'd like to say, we've pledged to increase the social housing budget from £1.5 billion to £6 billion. £5 billion of that comes from ending the mortgage interest relief that private landlords get. And also, if we move people out of the private renting sector back into the social sector, it's going to save a huge amount on housing benefit. At the moment, 9 billion, 40% of the housing benefit goes to people in the private rented sector, where the rents are much higher and therefore the housing benefits being paid are a lot higher. So if we bring people back into the social housing sector where the rents are lower, the housing benefit budget also comes down. So again, that's going to free up several £1 billion worth of spending, which can be spent on affordable homes.
So how does UKIP respond to that then, Dennis?
Richard, yeah.
Richard, sorry.
Yes, it's interesting hearing the other parties talking about the billions of pounds they're going to find from nowhere, because of course at the moment the country has a big deficit, and coming out of the European Union, which of course is UKIP's main policy, that's our cornerstone policy, will free up billions of pounds.
But how does that address the local authority and local?
At least £10 billion, and also the money that we're going to save on foreign aid, which we're also going to reduce. I thought that wouldn't go down too well. But as you all know, a lot of foreign aid doesn't go where it's supposed to go, and it's misused.
This is not the debate for tonight.
We want to make sure it's used properly. But coming back to housing, the more houses that are built will bring the prices down. If you say where's the money coming from for building the houses, it's got to be really, I'm afraid it's got to be down to private enterprise and housing associations. We've got to help youngsters get on the housing ladder. It's interesting, isn't it, that if they're in sort of social housing and they can do these shared equity schemes and they perhaps purchase 40% of the house, they pay rent, they're actually worse off than if they buy the house themselves. So if they can be helped, interest rates are very cheap at the moment, but of course there's credit scores and it's very difficult for them to raise the money for the deposits. So if these youngsters can be helped with their deposits, that will help them onto the rung of the housing ladder.
All right. Any response from CPRE? No. Richard?
Yeah, I think it's a little defeatist to say we can't afford it. Housing associations are the key to providing more affordable homes in the country. Housing associations are primarily privately funded organisations, not relying to a significant degree on public sector subsidy. So housing associations will fund around 75 to 80% of the cost of most new developments with private funding. Many of you will know the Malvern Vale site, the former North site in Malvern, or my organisation, Fortis Living, will soon have built 180 affordable homes, some for rent, some for shared ownership sale, without a penny of public subsidy being involved in that. So affordable housing can be built by housing associations without significant recourse to public funds.
So you're saying the council cap is irrelevant from your point of view?
Yes, I mean, most of you in the audience will know that most local authorities in Worcestershire no longer have their council housing. It's been sold some years ago to housing associations. So certainly in this part of the world, housing associations are the key to more affordable housing. Local authorities, my friend in the middle there, absolutely have a role in other parts of the country. I agree that raising the borrowing cap would assist local authorities, but in this part of the world, it's primarily housing associations that hold the key.
I've got nothing against housing associations. I've been on the management committee of 2 housing associations.
I can feel a but coming.
Yes.
But
Richard, I'm sorry to say that Richard is misleading us. What happened in the late 70s was that all the major political parties said, let's rely on private developers helped by housing associations to meet our housing needs, and they never have done and they never will. Housing associations do not operate on a scale that could meet the need for all our affordable housing, and Richard knows perfectly well that the maximum number of new units that housing associations have achieved in any modern time is, I don't know, not more than about 40,000 homes a year. It will not increase significantly, and it makes no sense whatsoever for government to say that it's okay for housing associations to borrow large sums of money in the private finance markets to build affordable housing, but it's not okay for local authorities to borrow money, which they could easily do against their assets and against their probity, to build many more houses than housing associations will ever achieve. And I would recommend that if such a programme came into being, Richard and many of his staff and other people in other housing associations up and down the country might go back to working for democratically elected local authorities.
I think Clive Smith had a question that follows on from that.
Do you want me to do the question?
Yeah, well, word it as you want in responding.
I think I'll just respond to that, and you can go on to another question. On to another question after that. There's a little gaggle here of district councillors who sit on Southern Area Planning, and you've got one up there. And the worrying thing we've had over the last 2 cycles, one, Persimmon, the developers of the north site, they wanted to reduce the number of do-it-yourself shared ownerships in the one application, because the private sector does not like lending mortgages. The model is all wrong. And then what we had the next time was a total social housing thing. They were 4-storey flats. One of our esteemed colleagues, Mike Soley, who in another life transported prisoners to Pucklechurch, said he hadn't seen anything like it since he used to go to Pucklechurch. Quite frankly, if Richard Chamins found a dog living in there, he'd probably shop the owners to the RSPCA, and we threw it out. Thank you.
As I say, I've got a lot of admiration for what Fortis do, but let's look at the figures. The housing stock that used to be run by Malvern Hills District Council, the housing stock was transferred to Fortis 20 years ago. 3,200 homes were transferred. The housing stock now stands at 3,900. So in other words, in 20 years, we've added 35 homes a year to the housing stock. And we have a waiting list at present, I think, of about 1,700. So I'm afraid it's simply not delivering at present. We're not delivering, and local authorities must get involved and must start building homes of their own. I'd also like to ask Richard, if I may, who said we must rely on private enterprise. Well, private enterprise is building a third of the homes that we need. In the last 20 years, it's delivered a third of the homes that we need. So how are you going to persuade the private developers to change their ways and start building 3 times the homes that they have been building?
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I don't think I did exactly say that. The point I was making was in response to the question about is there enough funding for new homes. My comment is there is sufficient funding for new homes. Housing associations will raise much of that money from private sources, thereby reducing the requirement for scarce public subsidy. Now, I don't want this to become a battle between local authorities or housing associations. We need 250,000 new homes a year. I'm delighted that local authorities, housing associations, private developers, charities all contribute towards that sum. And I think we're missing the point if we try and say who should be doing more than one or the other. It's important that all organisations collaborate to produce the homes that we need.
But is there a reason why we're not building? I mean, is finance one of the reasons we're not building enough houses?
I think finance is one of the reasons. You all know that mortgage availability has become much more scarce in recent years. Land is a significant issue. There isn't sufficient land with planning permission to build 250,000 homes a year. We need political will, political direction, political support to move towards a larger house building programme in the country.
Richard. Yes, I'm just coming back to the gentleman's question. I mean, one way certainly. I think the big firms I mentioned, Persimmon and that. I think they're keen to build houses, although we all know there's a shortage of bricklayers, etc. And I won't go into the government's policy of sending everybody to university, so we've lost those manual skills. But there is a shortage. But I think one way, of course, is to somehow or other quicken up the planning process, which is very laborious. And I know there's people who are on the planning committee going to shake their head, but that might be one way of getting of speeding things up. And just coming back to the question, I think you were saying earlier that you wanted more council-owned properties as opposed to social housing. Correct in saying that? Yeah. I mean, we go back. And that's probably very fair, but I mean, if you look back to the 1980s, I think Thatcher's flagship policy, wasn't it, was selling off the council houses, and her idea was to give everybody home ownership, which was a sort of cornerstone of our economy. But part of the problem then was that councils couldn't maintain these properties, which is why they were quite happy to sell them off. Of course, the policy didn't work because they didn't replace them, and we ended up with more homeless people around than there were before. So I mean, the policy totally backfired, but that was the policy at the time.
Yeah, thank you. Dennis.
Yeah, and this really links back to what I was trying to say in trying to answer the previous question, which was I do agree with some of the things mentioned there. Sorry, I've forgotten your name down there, the chap with the beard. I agree that you can't rely on one particular way of solving this housing crisis. I think the scale of it is just far too big. I think we know that. We know that on government level, we know it on local level, but there are other factors at place which are preventing of that. We do need private building going on. We do need local authorities to be able to build and sell houses as well. And we also do need possibly government level to get involved as well, because the scale is so huge we're not getting the numbers of houses up to meet that quota. And if that goes on and on and on and on, you know, the whole thing will crash. So we do need a variety of building programmes going on to be able to solve that crisis.
You've had the mic for a while now.
I think, as you were saying on the houses needs to cut the waiting down, particularly elderly people and disabled people, cut the waiting span down, build these more houses. You know, it must be very frustrating living with relatives, living with partners. It must be very frustrating. More needs to be done.
So can I just say, I absolutely agree, there does need, more needs to be done. But I think one of the big problems that this constituency has, as I understand it, is, you know, it's okay, everybody, I can't imagine anyone disagrees with building affordable housing. We need affordable housing to resolve this crisis. You know, our kids, you know, I've got a son at 14, 15, and I'm terribly worried about how he's going to get on the housing ladder. And, you know, in this constituency, you know, we've got a problem. We've got land which is there to build, but where do we build it? You know, we want to protect our green fields, which I support entirely, but it's supporting it in the right manner, and it's getting that balance again, you know, like Hazeland Fields. I supported that campaign because it's a condensed community. It's absolutely essential for that community to enjoy a certain quality of life, to enjoy that shared area. And there are places like that which need to be protected, and affordable housing maybe should not be built there. But there are other land which is like brownfield sites, and other aspects of land which we could consider building on. But I do know there are very strong process and feelings in this constituency about where to build it, and communities have every right to speak their voice and protest if they do not want a specific proposal of development built there. But we have to be realistic as well, in that, you know, if we protest everything, nothing's ever going to get built.
I think Jess is going to, I think, sharpen that point for us. Jess?
Given the vast housing deficit and limited brownfield sites, isn't greenfield development inevitable?
I think we go first to you, Frank, on that.
I agree with you that it is inevitable that there should be some development on greenfield sites, particularly, say, around Malvern, where there's an absence of brownfield sites. Clearly, we haven't had the history of industry that, say, Birmingham and Coventry had, so we haven't got a lot of brownfield sites, and similarly Worcester, of course, where there's a lot of areas where there used to be work, which now doesn't exist. But gradually these brownfield sites are being used. And although, as Richard said, CPRE does estimate that there are many thousands of hectares of land that could be used, not all these are in suitable places. A lot of them are in northern England, where perhaps people don't necessarily want to live. There's a great deal of pressure coming out of Birmingham and London, but generally that pressure is towards Worcestershire and Warwickshire. Worcestershire has lost a tremendous area of its county in the 1970s. We lost all the north of Worcestershire to Birmingham. Warwickshire has lost a lot of its area to Coventry. And I think that there is a limit to how much people are prepared to tolerate a decrease of quality of life. If you buy a house in a nice area, you probably pay quite a lot for it, and you want it to remain like that. You are not too happy if the field opposite you is suddenly turned into 100 houses. So we have to balance two things. Well, we have to balance the need to build affordable houses, but we also need to cut back on the numbers of people who need those houses. Now let me have just a quick query about this statement that we need 250,000 houses a year. The increase in population of this country since 1850, after the Irish potato famine, has averaged 250,000 every year. But if you've got 250,000 people, you don't need 250,000 houses. You need something like 100,000 houses. So I think there is some exaggeration in the number of houses that we need, and we should strike a balance between building more houses than are required and losing the countryside. Because in the end, we are going to suffer through a country which is dependent completely on imports of food, and we are going to lose a lot of the valued landscapes and valued countryside which we wish to protect. As you know, green belts are now under threat. If you lived in Bromsgrove or Redditch, you would find that that green belt doesn't mean a lot. Birmingham is talking in terms of building at least 30,000 houses outside Birmingham in the next 30 years, and those will go into North Worcestershire. So there's tremendous pressure coming on us due to population increase, and we have to do, first of all, control our population, stabilize the population, and then we can put the houses that we need in the areas where we want them. Thank you.
We're hearing about the need for balance from different places where I think would probably strike the balance in different places. So I think there's a question of how do you decide where the balance is struck, and so that there is both the protection but that people are not homeless. But Richard.
Yeah. I'm just going to say that as you'd expect, I think I agree with entirely most of what Frank has said. But coming back the lady's question, we're in UK very keen on brownfield sites, but ultimately it might be that we'll have to build on our beautiful countryside. But local people do need to have a say in what goes on. With the situation at the moment, there can be a planning application and our councillors can turn it down. The developer then has a right of appeal. And invariably the inspector comes up from Bristol, the government inspector comes up and overturns the decision of the council and gives the go-ahead. But of course the opposite doesn't happen. If the council pass a planning application, there's no right of appeal from the local people, and this seems to be wrong. We think local people need more of a say in where developments go, and maybe this could be done even with local referenda, possibly.
But if local opinion always says we don't want more housing, how then are the young people housed?
I think local people are probably a little bit more. I think local people are probably a little bit more sensible, actually, than what you think. I think you're perhaps being a little bit patronising. People do accept that we need more housing. I accept that people don't want a field built on that's right outside their front window, but there's other people in the village that might be quite happy for that field to be built on. So it could be done rather more democratically. But I just feel local people, even local planners, must have the final say.
We've got a voice we've not heard before.
Sorry, I'd just like to make a point on local referenda. The experience of California with direct democracy has been that people invariably vote for all the benefits and vote against all the taxes that will go to pay for it. I feel that if we did actually end up in a situation where certainly people in positions such as myself who are looking for a house can't find one, if we're relying on the grace of everybody else around us to allow developments to happen locally, we'd be completely out of luck, because people don't want to, they just don't want to have the pain that they will feel of losing their view, and don't think about the benefits to the other people around them that may be 2 or 3 steps down the social web.
I don't think development on greenfield sites is inevitable, and I don't think it should be inevitable. This is a beautiful constituency. place of natural beauty. There are big issues here with maintaining that fabric of this constituency. And I think a lot of people who are sat here have bought into that. You know, you've bought your house, you've bought your plot, you've got a place of beauty, you love living here. I think that's the issue. You know, it's worth protecting, it's worth fighting for. And I think, you know, like Hazelham Fields, I did get involved in that to a degree, in feeling quite strongly about it, because that field, it's not good enough to say, well, we need the houses and we should be there, and the planning officer should have the final say. Community must have their say. You know, you have to live next door to that field that will be developed upon. It's your space, your area, that gives you that quality of life that you've bought into. And I think any proposal for planning has to have a community view. It should not be down to just a couple of people. Where would we be if everybody decided on that level and had no view from the community and we could just build what we want? Because actually, that is what is going on at the moment with the councils. The SWDP plan is atrociously abysmal. It's supposed to be there to safeguard what all parties have agreed, and we will have builds in specific areas, agreed by all parties. That's not happening, it's never happened. The Conservative-controlled run councils have not adhered to that plan. They've let planning proposals go through which have nothing to do with the plan. So they're obviously not adhering to that plan. So it's not surprising that from time to time we all get quite frustrated and thinking, what is going on? And that is actually what is going on.
Right,
we need a plan in the council, and there hasn't been one there for a very long time.
We've got some other hands. I'm looking for new voices for the moment.
Most of the developments that have been going on recently are pretty high density developments, and everybody, you know, sort of like chunks of villages on the outskirts of pretty much every village. You have a chunk of development, and that's the sort of development which creates conurbations. You know, it all just creeps into one area. If the planning in the countryside was released a little bit when before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in the countryside, and there was lots of small developments within it, lots of small little self-sustaining little groups of houses, much more than there are now. We are trying to protect something which people lived in a very sustainable way. But we keep on building high-density houses, and they don't have any green space around them. They're badly designed and very poorly built. If we went back to a situation where we were spread ourselves a little bit more evenly and trying to preserve a landscape.
I think we've got that point. Yes, thanks.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the gentleman's put it extremely well. We've had an enormous amount of NIMBYism here, not in my backyard. We don't have enough brownfield sites. We want to preserve the green lungs within towns, but we don't want to build on the green fields either. It's an impossible equation. Let's look at some of the facts here. Only 10% of the land in this country is urbanized. 10%. So the idea that we're concreting over the countryside just doesn't stack up. It's 10%, of which 1% is currently devoted to domestic housing. The fact is that we have always had low-impact housing in the countryside. When we look at the South Worcestershire Development Plan, which I agree is a shocking plan, and I voted against it at every stage. Some of the large urban developments were absolutely appalling. The Green Party in Malvern was the only party locally that presented an alternative to the South Worcestershire Development Plan. And our plan was that every settlement within Malvern Hills District, every settlement should take a proportionate share of its housing. So small villages would take 1 or 2 homes, larger villages would take a few more. This was far more sustainable, because we don't have the infrastructure in place to support these large urban developments, and we're not going to get the infrastructure because at the moment local authorities are trying to catch up with the developers, and local authorities' funding has been terribly cut. So we don't have the infrastructure. So if we allow each of the developments to expand proportionately in a sustainable way, the added benefit also is that those developments will become self-sustaining. It will support local economies, which I think is what the gentleman was saying over there. We've always had these small developments that have been self-supporting. At the moment, post offices, pubs and so on are closing because they haven't got the populations to sustain them. The other factor is, as I say, we're building these large unregulated developments, and we're encouraging people to travel from them into the towns, through the countryside. So we're putting extra roads through the countryside in order to reach the towns. How is that protecting our countryside? We should be allowing each of the developments to expand in a sustainable way, and we wouldn't need to be putting roads through the countryside.
We're sitting here in a church, and I've not heard anybody talk about the immorality of people that are being denied proper housing in our community. We're all complicit in this, aren't we? Because most of us, imagine in this place, are owner-occupiers, and we're obsessed with our house. We have an economic recovery that has been predicated on housing. And we're all required to use the investment we've got in housing, in some cases to fund our pensions, in some cases to fund our care costs, in some cases to help our kids buy another house in this ridiculously inflated market. What we need is some form of government intervention, and that goes for me in terms of the owner-occupied sector and also the privately rented sector. We've got to take away the idea that buying a home is an investment. It's not. It's an investment in a family and their future, but it's not an investment on which we can rely and which requires us to put the drawbridge up when anybody ever suggests building a house at the bottom of our garden. I think also we need a situation where the private rented sector needs a bit of regulation, and this is where the guy at the front here makes a very good point about council housing. The most efficient way of producing social housing is the council house. And the reason why houses were transferred in Malvern Hills district, and because the council couldn't afford to apparently maintain them, was because of the way they draw up the rules on public sector borrowing. And if you were unable to borrow against the asset, which is a council house, has been said, you can produce social housing. And you can produce social housing where people don't have to worry about being moved after 6 months because the landlord wants possession. And where the landlord decides that he wants possession because he wants to put the rents up to add to the 25 billion housing benefit bill. We hear about people squeezing the welfare sector. We never hear about the bulk of that 25 billion going to landlords, do we? Yeah, we never hear about that. And so I think we need a bit of morality in the system, and we need to make sure that housing becomes a bit more of a human right and less of an investment and an opportunity to make and exploit people who don't have the benefit of the bulk of the people sat in this room, which is a nice warm home to go to tonight, where a number of people in this town don't have that. Let's have a bit of that when we talk about housing.
Thanks for that point.
Development plan, which is not being used, it's been ignored, there's nothing in place, and we've got this situation where there should be some form of regulation on the councils in particular who run those councils, the Conservative-run councils, and it's an awful situation when you find that you have a development going on and they allowed that through and it had nothing to do with what they were advising where to build these developments in the development plan. So they need regulating and kept a close eye on that they just don't go building willy-nilly.
Richard, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I agree with many of the points that were made there. I think we need to be honest and realistic about the issues involved in doubling the number of new homes that are built in the country. And referring to the question earlier, that will involve some development on some green fields. We need to pick the right green field. We need to use brownfield land as well, obviously. But we're not going to double the number of new homes that we build in order to deal with the housing crisis unless we're honest, grown up and realistic about meeting those challenges.
Richard?
The gentleman at the back talking about renting private sector from private landlords. One UKIP policy is that tenants do need some security of tenure. So in fact, they won't be asked to leave after 6 months or 12 months or whatever. It's a sad fact, isn't it, that actually home ownership is sort of becoming the right of the older and more wealthy individual in this country. And coming down to the gentleman over here about building small, instead of building one estate with 50 houses, build 10 estates with 5 houses each dotted around villages, which is excellent, but it's unfortunate fact of life, it all comes down to profit, doesn't it? And it's more profitable, unfortunately, to build the 50 houses in one place than it is to build 5 lots of 10. And of course, if we want more houses, which we do need more houses, obviously they have to be built at a reasonable cost.
Can we go back to the questioner? Jess, is it you originally asked the question?
Just by way of response, and just to give a little bit of context, when we're talking about brownfield development, something that we haven't really spoken about is the remediation costs that often involves. It can go up to hundreds of millions of pounds, and again, that is given as the responsibility for the developer, but in terms of clean-up, shouldn't that be something that the state takes some sort of responsibility for as well? And what Julian said about 10% of England that is built on, the UK as a whole, that actually goes down to only 2% when we're thinking in terms of the balance.
I'm going to, we've only got 5 minutes left, and I want to just change the direction a little bit and ask Richard Perkins for his question.
Why has there been such slow progress towards carbon neutral housing in this country?
I'll start off if you want. I think the answer is because it's expensive. And that's the honest answer. It will cost more, and I don't think a large proportion of the house buying public are prepared to take on the additional costs of making homes carbon neutral. There is a government policy in place which seeks to make homes carbon neutral by next year. I don't think that's a realistic prospect at all. I think it comes down to marketability and saleability of housing and to a degree what the public is prepared to pay for.
Anyone else?
Well, I think it comes down to what this Richard was saying, that it all comes down to profit. So if we allow the developers to dictate the terms, it's absolutely right that we won't get the carbon neutral housing. Again, this is another reason why we have to intervene into the market to build this housing for ourselves. I'm afraid I don't disagree with the other Richard, or rather I do disagree with the other Richard, because I don't believe it is expensive to build. Carbon neutral housing can be built very inexpensively, very cheaply. And what is more, they're much cheaper to run, they're much cheaper to heat, so over the lifetime of the home, the house owner is saving a lot of money. And we have to sell the benefits of carbon neutral homes to the house buyers, because over the life of the home, they are going to be saving a lot of money. So we do need to do a lot more, but we do need intervention, because it's not going to happen if we leave it to the developers.
I think that's our final. We're up to our time, and I think so. That's an interesting way to finish. So I'd like to thank the panel very much, and I hope you do like to thank the panel for their contributions tonight.